Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new session of the Consciousness and Reality Grad Conference organized by the students in the Mind the Brain MA program in Cognitive Science at the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And our next speaker today is a true friend, Robert Chiș-Ciure. He's with the University of Bucharest and with Wisconsin-Madison. Today, he'll be speaking to us about a priori versus a posteriori explanatory strategies in consciousness science. Robert, please take it away.
Thank you, Andrei. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction. You've been an amazing host so far, and as you always are. Okay, so let me open the presentation like this.
It's because the speakers are so good. That's the reason.
You're generous as usual. But that's true. Okay, so one thing to note before I start is that my take on this aspect on this talk today is primarily philosophical, even though I will be talking about scientific theories of consciousness, and I will focus on even on empirical details, especially for the second theory, and we will introduce some technical treatments, but not too much as to cloud the final point, which is more humble in my regard, as I said, and it is merely descriptive. I want to compare how do these big theories. There are two big theories. One is, I would say, one of the biggest theories, integrated information theory. The other is rising contestant temporospatial theories of consciousness, which have plenty of experimental evidence backing their claims. How do these theories construct their philosophical foundations? And they have different ways to do that. One is a priori, one is a posteriori, and I will give example for that, but I will refrain from comparing them from a prescriptive point of view. How should they do? Because in the limit, no a priori or purely logical test can be conceived for a scientific theory that cannot be itself entirely a priori. And I will make a point about that later. But what I think is valuable, especially since consciousness science is in quite a predicament right now with many models and many theories that kind of talk past each other. They have a siloed evolution, coevolution, where they have many things in common, but also many things that differentiates them. And there is no crucial experiment in famous phrase to distinguish between them. So I think philosophical work on this front to conceptually discriminate strategies and the way scientific theories are articulated can be worthwhile, even though I will refrain today from making a critical claim, even though I'm working on that. And to finish the caveat here, I am collaborating. I was a Fulbright student, Fulbright fellow for 1 year at Professor Tononi's, which is the author of Integrated Information Theory, and I'm currently affiliated to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working for them. And I am myself, let's say, an architect of IIT in a very limited sense. Also, I'm collaborating with Professor George Nortov, which is the author of Temporospatial Theories of Consciousness. We are working together on an article. We are working together for some grants. So there is, I am with my feet in both ships. So that's why I want to be kind of agnostic, but also explain in more depth what these theories are about and see whether philosophically there are significant discrepancies. So let's proceed. I will start by specifying the explanandum, and of course, I think everyone involved is knowledgeable about what consciousness is, at least definitionally, and this will be taken care of very briefly. So consciousness and explanandum: consciousness is subjective experience, or what is it like to be like something. It's phenomenology in the famous Hegelian definition, and we have here some references and overviews. I would say that among other problems, there are three big problems about consciousness: the demarcation, the character, and the function. The demarcation problem is simply the fact that a theory must account for the presence or absence of consciousness in a given system. The character problem would be that the theory must explain why a particular experience or a content thereof feels the way it does. And we know that Chalmers' famous book from 2010 is called, like that, The Character of Consciousness. And finally, for some theories, function and the function problem, which says that the theory must explain what functions, if any, conscious experience has, since epiphenomenalism is a quite unsavory position. So that's specifying the explanandum. We got that fast, and I believe there are no problems. Andrei, if at any point in time you lose me and you don't hear me well, please let me know. The system notified me that there might be some problems with the connection. Okay.
Thanks so much for saying that. And we're online and we're tuned and we're eager to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Great. I am glad. Thank you for that. Now, I will present first integrated information theory, IIT, by Giulio Tononi and colleagues, then the Temporospatial theory of consciousness by Georg Northoff and colleagues, and then I will contrast these two explanans for the explanandum, which is consciousness. Great. Now, there are two big theories, so it's I would say it's not really possible to present theories exhaustively, neither one in this amount in the time I have. So what I will do, I will try to be as brief as possible and explain the minimum necessary to understand the theory. It will feel a bit like a forced march, but it has to work. But I trust things will suffice in the end. So let's go. I will focus on the philosophical foundations of IIT, which I take to be a priori, and I have published some works on that, and there are other works forthcoming, and I've also discussed things with Giulio Tononi on this matter. So I would say that the analysis has some backing by the proponents of the theories themselves. Okay, now IIT has 6 main axioms, 6 postulates, and 1 identity, and we will see which is which. First is existence, which simply says the axiom of existence says experience exists, is immediate, is indubitable. We know that, again, illusionism is not particularly attractive. And the postulate of existence says that the world of cause-effect power exists. Basically, based on its regularities, I infer the existence of a world independent of me. I call it physical, if I can operationally observe it, and you can notice the eye here, and manipulate the hand and a substrate, which would be, in this case, a brain, whose units can make and take a difference. So whose units can be affected causally. And this yields conditional probabilities, which are here on the top, and that capture the cause-effect power that you can assess operationally, and they are summarized by the substrate model on the left. This A, B, C, D, I, O. Okay, great. That's existence. Well, now intrinsicality. Intrinsicality says that experience is subjective, existing for itself, not for something else. That's the axiom. It exists from the intrinsic perspective from within, not from an extrinsic perspective from without. Now, just as my experience exists for itself, the postulate says that the physical substrate of consciousness, PSC, physical substrate can be a brain, can be something other, that some other substrate that undergirds consciousness itself. So the physical substrate of consciousness must have cause-effect power for itself. For instance, in the example here, A, B, C, D, D is affected by A, B, and C, and it affects itself. The dotted blue line indicates a candidate substrate whose causal power may be analyzed as a transition probability matrix. You see that in the right, upper right, which is called the TPM, transition probability matrix. And the background conditions are fixed, the I and the O with the needle on them, right? Now, basically, if experience is subjective and exists for its subject from its intrinsic perspective, the cause-effect power of the substrate, IIT says, must be the same, must be intrinsic. And that means the cause-effect power must have the power to affect, the cause-effect substrate must have the power to make a difference and take a difference from itself. This is how the theory goes. It creates explanatory correspondences between the properties of experience and the properties of cause-effect power in a candidate substrate, which is called the physical substrate of consciousness. Now, the second essential property of experience, first was subjectivity or intrinsicality, second is composition or structuredness. So experience is structured into components, not contentless. Its components are phenomenal distinctions bound by relations, yielding a phenomenal structure. Now, if my experience is structured, that means the cause effect power of the substrate must also be structured. It means it must have subsets that specify causal distinctions bound by relations, yielding a cause effect structure. Now, in the example, we see that the cause effect structure is the one faded in gray. Distinctions are the one in orange, AD and ACD, and they comprise a cause, you see, which in red is ABC, and an effect in green, D and BD, linked through a mechanism, that's in black. The distinctions are bound by relations in purple and blue, a two relations and a three relations, because their causes and their effects overlap. So that's a relation, an overlap between the causes and effects of a given distinction. And that would again explain how composition works, how the structuredness of experience works. Now, the third axiom and postulate is that of information. It says on the consciousness side, it says experience is specific, not generic, is the way it is, and so are the distinctions and relations that compose it. Just as my experience is specific, the cause effect power unfolded from a physical substrate must be in a specific state. In this case is A, B, C, D, which A means lowercase means off, uppercase means on. So A on, B on, A off, B on, C off, D on in this example. And this cause effect structure has itself specific state. And as my experience is specific, it can be differentiated from countless other experiences. We see these two examples with a building or with a beach on the upper left. And so that the cause effect structure can be differentiated by many other states. Look, we can see ABCD in different on-off configurations. Good. That's information, and it means specificity of experience and of the cause effect structure. Now, integration, which is very important, as all are, but integration is integrated information theory, and we will see why. The axiom says that experience is unitary, not multiple. It is a whole that cannot be subdivided into parts that not exist for each other. Now, the postulate says that the physical subset of consciousness must have cause effect power that is also unitary. It must be irreducible to subsets that do not exist for each other. So how do we assess whether something is irreducible? We partition, we cut. You see the red scissor in the picture, in the middle of the picture. For instance, in this case, we cut between the units A, B, D, which with A off, B, D on, and we cut C out, which is off. And thus we affect the distinctions and relations that make each part exist for the other. You see the cause effect structure on the upper right that was full versus the cut one. There is a big difference that the cut made, and the phi in the middle is IIT's main measure. It's big phi, and it's a measure of integrated existence. It reflects how much an entity exists as one entity. So it exists over and above its parts, exists in a sense as one single unit. Good. Now we get to the last axiom and property of experience, which is that it is definite. Exclusion says experience is definite, not indefinite. It has the content it has and the grain it has. As the experience is definite, the cause effect power must also be. And that means that the border of the physical substrate is the set of units over a given substrate that exists the most. In this case, it is A of B on, C of D on, which exists the most because it has maximal phi. Phi being this measure, it has the maximum amount of integrated information, and that in IIT exists the most. That's the principle of maximal existence. And it excludes all overlapping subsets or supersets. In this case, BCD in the upper right, and IABCD, the big one. Good. So now, these are the axioms and postulates of IIT. And the next step is the central identity and the last part of the a priori foundations. And it's mainly an explanatory identity, according to which an experience is identical to a phi structure or a cause effect structure. A phi structure or a cause effect structure are synonymous. Now, this is an explanatory identity. So it claims that experience is identical to this posited construct. But what does it mean? Now, a phi structure captures the full cause effect structure of a substrate in a state unfolded according to the postulates of IIT, according to the 6 postulates, 5 plus 1 plus existence. But the 5 postulates are applied to the cause-effect power of a substrate, and it is unfolded. And you get this very complicated structure, which is a cause-effect structure, a phi structure. Now, how does this account for consciousness? It accounts for the quality of consciousness or the contents of that given experience by means of its substructures, of its phi folds. A fold is a substructure of the cause-effect structure, and it accounts for the quantity of experience, how much, or the level of consciousness, how strong experience is in that particular moment. It accounts for by phi, by the maximal value of the scalar measure of phi, of integrated existence. Now, the physical subset of consciousness, which is in the bottom, is the brain, is not viewed as generating the phi structure of as identical itself with the experience. No, it is just the operational basis for unfolding through observations and manipulations the cause-effect power, and that can be done from the extrinsic perspective of a researcher, for instance. Good. Now, these were the theoretical minimum of IIT. And now let's go to the other theory, which has a different strategy, I would say, and let's see how that pans out. Great. Now, this is the temporospatial theory of consciousness, and I would say it has a posteriori foundations. And its main proponents is Georg Northoff and its collaborators. I am currently working with Professor Northoff on a paper comparing IIT, TTC, and also global neural workspace, and we will see what comes out of that. But it's mainly an empirical paper, though we have discussed much, and I run by him some of these topics here, and I think perhaps they would be interesting to have to be in a paper of their own, these philosophical considerations. Now, the first insight of TTC, temporospatial theory of consciousness, is that there is a common currency between brain and mind. And let's see what's that. It is the spatial topography and temporal dynamics that is the interface or common currency between neural activity and mental features of the mind. This is an a posteriori claim. It's an a posteriori principle, and there is a quote by Nikola Tesla that Professor Northoff loves. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Good. Now, this is the main, I would say, the main principle of TTC. Let's see here. Good. Now, this principle is fleshed out in terms of 4 mechanisms. And these are all empirical hypotheses derived by empirical studies and backed by empirical evidence. Now, these are the mechanisms of temporospatial nestedness, alignment, expansion, and globalization, and they have empirical and ontological implications, actually empirical ontological implications, as Professor Northoff likes to call them, and they entail an a posteriori necessity a la Kripke, which I will touch in a minute. First mechanism of nestedness, it says that a particular type of organization of different spatial and temporal scales of neural activity are contained or nested within one another. That means nestedness. It's the organization, the spatial temporal organization of neural activity that is embedding itself at different levels. And there are different measures of that. For instance, the power law exponent, the cross-frequency coupling, the autocorrelation windows, these are all empirical measures designed to measure in different neuroscientific techniques and modalities to measure this idea of a mechanism of nestedness, of temporospatial nestedness. For instance, in general anesthesia, there is a breakdown of temporal and spatial organization of spontaneous brain activity. And also, interesting, in the anesthetic state, in slow frequencies, there is a global reduction of scale-free activity. And scale-free activity is reflected by the power law exponent, which is an index of the temporal structure of the activity itself, of the brain activity itself. Now, nestedness as a mechanism is considered to be a neural predisposition of consciousness, NPC, and it's connected, is the mechanism behind the level or the state of consciousness. And we remember that was phi in the IIT story. Right. Next mechanism is alignment, one of my favorites and one of the most interesting one, because it gives a sense of how in TTC the world and the brain connect and align, and that's very important. But this I won't talk about. Is about the neuroecological model of consciousness that TTC proposes. It's outside the scope of this paper, but it's one of the most important mechanisms in the framework. And alignment says that the brain encodes the context by adapting and thereby aligning or matching its own neural activity to the various inputs or stimuli that shape the context. Some of the most important measures are coagulating around the intrinsic neural timescales. This is a measure itself, but also a concept, and it can be measured by autocorrelation window, by temporal receptive windows, and other measures derived from the literature, especially INT and ACW. So intrinsic neural timescales and autocorrelation window are important in the TTC literature. Is INT, the intrinsic neural timescales are the key in the brain matching the temporal-spatial dynamics of the environment. It is reduced in loss of consciousness, this stochastic matching between brain and environment. In abnormal states of consciousness, in loss of consciousness or states of low consciousness, you can see abnormally slow power spectrum, so as indexed by the power law exponent, and abnormally long autocorrelation windows. But in normal conditions, you don't see that. In normal conditions, or even in locked-in syndromes where you just have a motor impairment, you don't see these kind of affections. Now, too much temporal integration without temporal segregation means no alignment to the world's faster timescales. So you must align to the world also on faster frequencies and slower, which means you need to segregate temporal moments and to also integrate them. Now, this mechanism of alignment is relevant for the form or structure of consciousness, being a prerequisite of it. It's a pre-NCC. Good. The third mechanism of expansion says that it reflects a particular form of non-additive interaction between pre-stimulus and post-stimulus activity. So spontaneous brain activity before a stimulus comes, that's pre-stimulus activity, and the post-stimulus or stimulus elicited brain activity. There is interaction between them that's non-additive. It's just not purely one activity added to one another or just put on top of the other. No, they interact non-additively, where the former is carried out or expanded onto the latter at the neural level. So the pre-stimulus activity is expanded into post-stimulus activity, and there is an accompaniment by a more or less corresponding expansion of the temporal spatial features of the external inputs or stimulus itself at the phenomenal level. So this is a phenomenal expansion. Basically, not only neural activity at the neural level, purely neuronal level, expands from the pre-stimulus period to post-stimulus periods, but also the temporal and spatial features of the stimulus itself expand in our consciousness. But there is a discrepancy between these two expansions, but let's not get into much detail. Main measure of this is trial-to-trial variability. The positive, for instance, the positive and negative non-additive interactions between pre-stimulus and stimulus-related activity are observed in different frequency bands, and the temporal spatial expansion is relevant for the contents of consciousness. This is an NCC in the traditional Koch definition, Crick and Koch definition from 1990. Actually, we see in the picture, the pre-stimulus non-additivity is between 0 and 300 milliseconds. And then you have stimulus evoked activity and post-stimulus non-additivity up to 500 milliseconds before stimulus. So it's this kind of expansion, a temporal expansion of the stimulus and also of neural activity. Good. The last mechanism, temporal spatial globalization. It's a continuation of expansion, refers to the global recruitment of regions and frequencies that are important for access consciousness when some content is processed and made dispositionally available to cognitive functions such as reasoning, speech, report, and behavior. So this is what makes TTC also a theory of access consciousness. You see the late expansion, which corresponds to some of the markers of global ignition in the global neural workspace, the P3B, which follows the 300 milliseconds postmark. you see that it's even later. It goes after 300 to up to 600 milliseconds, and that allows for flexible and sophisticated cognitive manipulation of incoming sensory stimuli. In our example is there's a runner. You see the runner first, and then you can also recognize and express things about it, basically process rationally that stimulus. But yeah, okay, this is the main let's call it the main function-based mechanism of TTC. Now, the common currency of between temporal and spatial structure and function between brain and mind, and the mechanisms are empirical considerations that have strong metaphysical implications, and those are that TTC's intrinsic neural timescales and temporal-spatial alignment allow the brain to relate to the world, constituting a world-brain relation, which empirically informs a relation-based ontology, where relations and structures are primary relative to elements. So from empirical considerations, Georg Nordhoff and colleagues drew an empirically driven metaphysics or ontology of ontic structural realism. Now, the existence and reality of spatial-temporal relations is manifested in a spatial topography and temporal dynamics of the brain, which are aligned to and nested within those of the world. And this is an important concept in TTC, the world-brain relation, and it lends itself to the idea of a neuroecological model where there is this continuum between neural activity and the world, but also consciousness. Consciousness is just part of this spatial-temporal commerce between the world and the brain. And finally, I will end by a quote from Dr. Nordhoff's book. I now argue that the world and the brain are necessarily a posteriori connected to each other, as well as to consciousness in a way that is more or less analogous to the relationship between H2O and water. In the same way that hydrogen and oxygen as molecules are internally related to each other, that is necessary a posteriori, world and brain show a necessary and thus internal relation with each other. This is what I describe as a world-brain relation. Moreover, as H2O is necessarily connected to water, world-brain relation is necessarily a posteriori connected to consciousness and to mental features. We see a very different strategy than with IIT. Now, let's go and finish this talk by contrasting these two explanans, but merely descriptively, not prescriptively. IIT and TTC reflect top-down and bottom-up strategies in solving the problem of the world consciousness relation. Now, IIT says that an experience is a priori. I would argue that the identity is a priori, so I will say something more about that in a bit. Necessarily identical to a cause-effect structure. An experience is identical to a cause-effect structure. Now, TTC would say that consciousness is a posteriori necessarily connected to the world-brain relation, which a posteriori necessarily connects the brain and the environment via their temporal-spatial structure and dynamics. Let's inspect a bit IIT's a priori elements. We saw that there are 6 axioms of phenomenal existence, which are, I would say, they are all a priori in all meaningful sense. It depends what you mean by a priori, but I would say they are a priori because you reflect on your own experience, but you don't rely on any particular experience to justify them. But you need your own experience, of course, to see whether there are contexts to experience its structure, whether it's specific, whether it's definite, whether it's subjective, and so on. 6 postulates of physical existence. And there is an important caveat that I didn't mention here. These are conceptual postulates, and I in a paper I distinguish between them, between the conceptual, the formalized, and the experimental postulates, which are not a priori, but the ones I presented I would take to be conceptual in more or less a priori sense, the ones that were presented here, even though it depends on how you define the a priori. But in my article I fleshed out in detail how this could work. The identity between the experience and causal structure, I would say it's constitutive a priori in the sense of Kant and Friedman in later philosophy of science. I argued about that in a different paper. And all in all these considerations boil down to an a priori ontology of intrinsic entities. An intrinsic entity is just one that is conscious and satisfies all the postulates. Its cause-effect power is intrinsic, is structured, is specific, is integrated, and is definite. And the interactions between them which are operationalizable as phi structures or cause-effect structures and their change. Now, finally, second, TTC's a posteriori elements are one principle according to which the temporospatial structure and dynamics is the common currency between neurality and phenomenality. There were 4 empirical mechanisms that specify how the neural and the phenomenal domains are linked via spatial topography and temporal dynamics. And finally, they have an empirically driven ontology. Relations and structures are primary, and that's one of the views they adopt, ontic structural realism relative to elements. Now, having said this, I would argue that both these theories in the philosophical foundation, so these are not the neither with TTC, neither with IIT, these are not all principles entailed by the theory, neither all predictions nor explanations, not all things that you can say about what a theory means in an experimental context. Those are empirical principles, and there is a very, very fine-tuned interaction between the a priori elements of a theory and the a posteriori ones. This is not at the time nor the place to discuss that, but what I would say is that Giulio Dononi and Georg Nordhoff thought in different ways of how to conceptually, not empirically, conceptually tackle the problem of the consciousness and the world, in the sense that consciousness is subjective and thereby only operationalizable under certain conditions. So it's not something that can be observed. I cannot observe your consciousness, you cannot observe mine. But that this main secludedness of consciousness elicited different strategies. And I would say IIT went a priori, while TTC went a posteriori. Whether one is better or the other, only final experience in Kant's terms, only the ultimate experience, the final experience, the total experience, would say. Experience in the sense meaning the course of scientific knowledge in the development of time. This is a neo-Kantian view, held also by Cassirer. But yeah, my main point was to take these theories, distill their commitments from a conceptual point of view, and see how they fare on these a priori, a posteriori distinctions. Whether one is better or the other, there are arguments pro and against, and I did not consider that here, but I would say that the final test of a theory of consciousness must involve verification in the brain. It will involve verification. That test will be empirical, but it's neither one experiment that confirm or falsifies the theory. Now, this being said, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Robert, and I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in applauding your work. Thanks again for that. And this would be high time for questions for Robert. And if you'd like to make yourselves known, please either raise your virtual hand, there's a reaction for that in the bar, or perhaps signal that in chat.
Let me also apologize for the much content that was presented very fast. So I know that's how it works. That's why I didn't want to say anything more and contrast the theories from a prescriptive point of view, because it was already too much. But I thank you once again.
This was absolutely beautiful. And let me just say, I believe the organizers baked this in, because I see that our next speaker, which is a keynote speaker, Hongyu Wang, is slated for 5 p.m. So that leaves us half an hour, and instead of a break, we could just talk philosophy. So let's see, we have a question from Marcelino Bottin. Marcelino, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much for the talk, Robert. That was really, really interesting. And I wanted to ask you about some of the stuff, especially about IIT. So I agree that the postulates of IIT, as you've explained them, they are a priori, right? A priori derived from introspective features of experience. But then you say that IIT takes the identity between the causal structure and the experience to be a priori. And that left me a bit puzzled, because I thought that the connections between the phenomenal, so the phenomenal postulates and the physical postulates by IIT are deductive, right? So there's no logical contradiction in them being false. So if that's so, they do not really dissolve the traditional concerns involved in the hard problem. Instead, they kind of bypass them. So I don't know. Yeah. So I was just wanted to ask you about what would make the connection once you've given the postulates. What would make the connection to the causal structure a priori? Seems to me that it wouldn't be a priori.
That's an excellent question, Martina. Thank you for it. And it's unfortunate that I would have to present in a few minutes the contents of two papers. One paper, I argue that it is a deduction between the postulates and the axioms, but it's a transcendental deduction a la Kant. And the story is more complicated. The only point I would say here is that, in my opinion, and this is not necessarily IIT orthodoxy, but it is a way to solve the problem of the relations. Giulio is a bit cagey about it, but my take as a philosopher is this. You have 9 fundamental concepts of reason, which are called categories, by which you build the IIT. You build the axioms by them, and then you build the postulates. There are also some operational assumptions that people don't know yet, physicalism, atomism, and realism. And these are all built by the same categories. And the way basically the axioms and postulates connect are that they are grounded in this same categorical lexicon, as I call it. And you need to deduce those categories, but that's a transcendental deduction, not an entailment between the. You cannot squeeze the physical out of the phenomenon. That's one important thing. They say the axioms are translated from or postulated. The postulates are postulated from or translated from the axioms, but they are not derived. It's not a normal deduction between them. Now, and how would that influence the identity? Why I would say that's a priori. I said it's constitutive a priori in a sense related to Kant. It's constitutive a la Kant. So that means, as a principle, you cannot falsify the identity. There is no experience that can falsify the identity. However, if you assume the identity between experience and cause-effect power or cause-effect structure with certain properties, then that opens an empirical space of possibilities where you can have precise experimental claims. So empirical hypotheses, for instance, the fact that the physical substrate of consciousness must be a maximum of integrated information. If you in the brain find that and you probe it and you see that the substrate of consciousness is not where the maximum is, you falsify, but you don't falsify the identity. You falsify one of the empirical hypotheses that needed the identity to be in place. That means, in a limited sense, being constitutive. So it's a priori because neither the axioms nor the postulates need empirical elements. So there is no empirical considerations here in justifying them. They are, let's call them constructs of reason, but then they must be deployed. And that's part of the verification. And that will be, of course, empirical. But the principles themselves, they do not rely on this verification. However, there is a feedback between verification in the brain and these a priori principles. It's not like in Northof's case, where Northoff looked at certain things that happened with certain measures proposed in experimental context, and then deduced that spatial temporal structure and dynamics is the way to go to connect neurality and phenomenality. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, that was really, really good. Thank you very much. If I may have a short follow-up.
Please go ahead.
So I was just, that was a fantastic answer, but I just wanted to, maybe something that could be helpful, which is another way of getting, okay, so another way of getting rid of the problem that I was trying to press, right, would be to claim that the hard problem has focused wrongly on the notion of a priori, that, the typical deductive notion of a priori. And the explanatory gap is constructed as such, right? The explanatory gap is constructed as it arises because we can't a priori derive phenomenal facts from physical facts. But from the way that, the Kantian notion, I'm not familiar whatsoever, but the way that you were putting it made me think of what I think is true, which is that you don't really need to breach the epistemic gap or the derivability gap in order to breach the explanatory gap. So right? So you can have explanations that give us everything we would want from an explanation, right? That are not deductive in the sense that would satisfy the usual construction of the hard problem. So if you think yeah, right. So if you
I
think
agree with you. The standard was just too high from the beginning. If it's a priori entailment, it will fail. It's unclosable in principle. But then that means you have unreasonably high standards for an explanation of consciousness. So what do you need more rather than, I mean, the whole problem boils down to this, at least in IIT story, you must start with experience. If you don't start with experience, you don't know what you're talking about. You must specify the explanandum, and that's the whole story with the essential properties. But then how do you get to, besides your own head, besides your own experience, you assume certain stuff, realism, physicalism, there is a world of cause-effect power, you can do manipulations on it, observe it, and so on, and then you can cut it, partition it, see how that affects the whole, the yada, 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 the entire story. But then if at the end of these recursive iterations, you get a theory that says there is this much consciousness present in the system, I can account for the content in this way. I have this theoretical construct of cause-effect structure, transformations of cause-effect structures, maybe even on informational topology derived from them. I can describe all these things in this way. I can account for space, for time, for objects, for whatever. What more do you need from me? Do you want me to show you that there is a priori entailment between some facts about the phenomenal to facts about the physical? There is none.
Yeah, awesome. That's really good. Thank you very much. I think that solves the hard problem in my eyes. So if you get that explanation, that's for me.
I published one, but it was some years ago, and unfortunately, I didn't have the concepts I have now. Yeah, maybe I will do it again.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcelo.
These are quite the statements, and we need to delve into them further. So thanks so much to you both. Amazing. I wonder if there's some more questions or comments or rejoinders. If not, let me just ask two very brief things of my own. These are very much coming from someone who's not at all familiar with this literature. But I had two very brief things, and then I see Sandra has a question of her own, and I'll just give way to her as well. So one concerned the information integration theory, and there's this old quip from, I just wonder who the first individual to raise this issue was, but you had this idea in Kaganov's The Logical Construction of the World that you had these quasi-experiences, and these were meant to be logical constructions of more rock bottom stuff, but they were meant to be the level at which we're consciously aware of something. And I raised this as a kind of as a question concerning where the tradition got started from that would equate conscious experiences with some mathematical structures, which at first blush would seem to be somewhat paradoxical because, well, let's put it crudely, experiences are concrete and structures are abstract. So that's a kind of a general puzzlement at the sort of undergrad level concerning IIT, and I wonder if you'd like to approach that first.
Sure thing. Thanks. That's a wonderful observation. I also thought about that connection with Karnav some years ago myself. But the main difference is the idea of operationalization. So in IIT, I didn't touch much on this metaphysics. It's an article of, as Karnav called it, as Quine called it, metaphysical article of faith. So IIT's main point is that experience is real, is the ultimate reality, is undeniably real, immediately real, and that's the starting point. It's ontological, but also epistemological. Now, all explanations, including cause-effect structures, including their transformations, including the fivefolds, the substructures, including the way you account for space, time, and objects, for instance, conceptual invariances by different substrates. For instance, for space in Haun and Tononi 2019, it was used a grid, an 8-node grid to account to say, look, if you have a grid that's connected in a certain way, that's a way to connect elements in a network, you can account for space in this way. For time, you'd have a directed grid, which undergirds the idea of a flow of time. For objects, you'd have a hierarchy or a pyramid, and so on. But now, all these explanations are instrumental. They are operational. The equation is not one that's primarily ontological. It's primarily epistemological. It's epistemic. So you equate experience with certain structures to explain it, but not to say that they're the same domain. We do not experience cause-effect structures, and neither they are introspectable in our own brains. For instance, I cannot introspect and reason on my cause-effect structure that, according to IIT, is responsible, or it is my experience right now. That's from the third-person perspective. So in Carnap, you don't have this operational criterion, I would say.
I think that's amazing. That sounds wonderful. But can I just briefly follow up on that and ask? So is that? It sounds different, but it sounds in the ballpark of saying that, look, mathematical structures are different from our conscious experiences, but we can let them pass for conscious experiences. If we wanted a nifty theory, we could have these kind of substitutes that are mathematical structures just to theorize them better or something like that. And this would be workable because there's nothing better than that on the market, right? This would be the sort of transcendental slant. I don't know. I just wonder.
Nice point with the transcendental slant. Yeah, with one caveat, maybe. First, they are not substitutes of experience. As I said, they are explanations, but they are substitutes of experience maybe only on the order of description. There is an important distinction between being and describing, as there is in IIT between being and doing. But being and describing said consciousness is, or it is being, it is ontology, whereas all cause-effect structures, all postulates, these are explaining, these are describing. Now, we cannot substitute description for being, but to understand being itself, we start introspectively reflecting on the essential structure of our experience. We see that it exists, it is subjective, it is structured, it is specific, integrated, and definite. And then, based on this, we construct a description that matches these properties and accounts, but does not replace the properties. They cannot. You cannot put language instead of being, except maybe in the logos sense, but that's another kind of language.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm genuinely grateful for this
question. Thank you very much.
It seems to me that in a different jargon, this recaps the distinction between structural and intrinsic properties that we're talking about with respect to Marcellino's talk. I have another question, but I'm going to hold off on that because we have a question from Sandra. Sandra, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I actually have request for clarification regarding TTC. So just to make sure, the temporal spatial expansion is the one that somehow accounts for qualia, but does TTC conceive of the phenomenal features, what it's like, I mean, as a temporal spatial features actually, so they're not like mental or cognitive, they're temporal spatial, right?
Yes, so go on. That's the question, that's the entire of it?
That's part of it.
Okay, so I noted it. Go on with the entire question, so I'll reply with.
Right. So the other question that I had is whether TTC, if you think it's somehow compatible with the category theory from mathematics, which actually focuses on the relation and the structure between the objects instead of thinking about objects in themselves.
Great. So, Sandra, let me tell you that you had an amazing insight with the category theory. If you would check north of Saigo and Tsuchiya, no, it's not. It wasn't Tsuchiya. It was north of Saigo and another person in 2019 and 20. There are 1 or 2 papers about how you apply category theory to TTC. So there is definitely an application. George would say it's the main mathematical development that's relevant for TTC, as information topology or intrinsic information formalism is relevant for IIT. From a very purely abstractly mathematical sense, this would be the machinery George would use to describe TTC's structure. So to describe the temporospatial structure in TTC. That's one thing. So your second question was very on point. There is a paper on that. Look for it, north of Saigo, 2019 or 2020. Now, for the other question, expansion and the contents of consciousness. I would say that at this point in time, TTC is sufficiently developed to cover in abstracto, so in a more rough sense, for certain features we associate with consciousness, and certainly qualia and the richness of the content goes right there. It's one of the top things we have to explain. I think by the mechanisms of expansion, you can account for certain properties of experience, and in this case, you could account almost like in a Kantian vein, and it's not arbitrary that George Northrop started as a Kantian. So you account for space and time of experience by the way you expand the neural activity within the brain. You can measure that, but then you can also relate that activity, given that your common currency is spatiotemporal dynamics. You can relate that activity to how experience itself from the phenomenal point changes, but that's at the spatial and temporal level. Now, if you were to account for the redness of experience, for the sharpness of a pain, for the amazing blending between an anxiety and reading Thomas Pinch and Gravity's Rainbow, now that's a story, that's a different story. Okay, so I would say it's too early to put one mechanism and say, look, this explains everything. No, I think this is work to be done. I think there are resources maybe for that, but I would not know, and I never discussed this with George, whether this kind of very rich forms of experience and very abstract are in the remote sense accessible right now at this index of time and development of science and technology.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that. And we're drawing near a close here, but we have another question from John Barton. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I hope you can hear me. Thanks for the talk. I hadn't come across your TTC theory before. I just wondered, does the theory imply that there's a gradation of consciousness from zero continuously upwards, perhaps in a multidimensional way, or is there some sort of threshold on the various measures you introduce, like the amount of autocorrelation or the amount of expansion that you need before you get any consciousness at all? Mm-hmm. So is there a sort of on-off gap, or is it just purely continuous?
So the implication would be whether TTC is committed to panpsychism or not, from a metaphysical sense of view, in a sense, because because if
I wasn't trying to introduce that, but
so okay, good. I think one of the things difficult to mention here is that, as we know, we can think about consciousness as very, very elementary. We can think of the consciousness of an electron or even a quantum system. But then we can measure to that degree of specificity and neither precision anything remotely. So at least in the neuroscientific sense. So all of our measures are incommensurably more coarse-grained than the way we can think of experience. So that imposes a strict limit on how we can operationalize and answer your question, because whether consciousness is in this way cannot be answered by empirical means, and TTC starts by empirical means. So perhaps I would be agnostic to answer definitely your question right now. Perhaps the answer would sound like this: if the measures give us at some point enough purchase on the idea of a minimum of consciousness that can be detected experimentally by using this index of spatial temporal structure and dynamics, then that will be the theoretical, the experiential minimum. Whether that minimum would extend down to the structure revealed by physics, that I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And a last, if ever so brief question. Just judging naively, thinking evolutionarily, this cognitive revolution, brains grow. At some point, we start inventing tools, right? And we should expect that there's this kind of cognitive offload to the tools we use. And from assuming this kind of extended mentation hypothesis, or assuming something in the ballpark of that, we should expect that there's offload not just to tools, but to other members of the community. We should expect that culture plays a big role in this. And so it would seem as though at every step of the way, which core correlates of consciousness are going to be salient, or might have been were someone to probe into this at the respective epochs, right, are going to be different. And so I wonder if that folds into Northrop's theory, or whether that's whether he thinks there are some more stable structures at play. So how do you view this?
That's a very good question, Andre, and it definitely does. The idea of a neuroecological model, which springs from the mechanisms of alignment, is a direct testament to your intuition. So we know from alignment that there is a resonance, a matching, a stochastic similarity between the way the brain activity works at spatial and temporal level and the way the world works at incommensurably higher spatial and temporal levels. And it's interesting, there is a problem, an evolutionary problem that the brain had to solve, and brains had to solve at all levels of species. And that is how much you embed of the environment in your own activity. And that means not only structural embedment, and that we see that in the way cortical patterns of evolution are preserved across different species, but also in the way your brain works. So being way more limited at the environment and having way less units, way less connections, the brain had to solve this problem. Okay, how much do I embed? Do I embed the Planck scale dynamics? No, I don't, because that's not relevant for my survival. Do I embed the temporal dynamics of celestial movements? No, because that's too coarse-grained and I have to act quickly. Now, the brain embedded different spatial temporal structures into its own activity and its own structure. Now, this idea of alignment, of resonance between these two stochastics, brains and environment, gives a sense of how there is actually a continuum between brain and world. So it's a matching, but also a relation, because the brain affects the world affects the brain affects back the world, and you have these levels of recursive iterations and so on. Now, whether consciousness can be extended in a similar sense, so you'd say that not only is the stimulus that's coming from the world relevant for your experience, but it's the way you use the pen, the way you use knowledge, the way you use culture, and the way you have a history, maybe even. So you have not only different spatial skills, but even temporal skills. Now, I would say that's important for TTC, But I would say that at some point, for any content of experience, there must be a finite, definite answer as to what part of the spatial temporal structure and dynamic accounts for it. So it cannot be all over the place. It will, the correlate might change, but if north of story is true, the physical is not a correlate, it's not just a correlate, it's a necessary a posteriori connection. So whether correlate is a good name, I don't know, but maybe a better name would be it's not also identical. That's interesting.
A basis?
Yeah, maybe that would be a better term. But yeah, I don't know. It's
We have a suggestion from John as well.
I said substrate, but like basis. Yeah.
It's very hard to say. You always run into this problem. You have to relate something from the intrinsic perspective to something from the extrinsic perspective. How do you say that? Yeah. So.
All right, thank you so much, Robert. This has been quite illuminating, and I'm sure we're going to talk much more about this. We're very grateful, and please join me in thanking Dr. Chiș-Ciure.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.